Welcome, Feisal Rahman. We're so glad we've solved the time zone challenge around the world. And it gives me great pleasure to turn to our second lecture of our Warming Planet webinar series today. And Feisal is going to be presenting the lecture that he and Saleemul Huq developed on community-based adaptation. So to introduce Feisal, he is the research coordinator of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, ICAD, at the Independent University in Bangladesh, although I think he's now stationed in Delhi. He's an environmental engineer by training, and his PhD is from University of Waterloo in Canada. And his work focuses on adaptation to climate change, political economy of climate change adaptation, and financing local level and locally led adaptation. Feisal, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Cynthia, and apologies to everyone because I was late. I'm currently in Delhi and so got mixed up with the time zone. But thank you for that kind introduction. I just wanted to add that I've actually moved from ICAD to Northumbria University as a postdoctoral researcher with the Living Delta Zone. But thank you. Without further ado, let me quickly share my screen and then I can probably move ahead with the lecture if that's all right.
Thank you, Feisal.
Can you see my screen? Are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, I probably joined quite a bit late in Pam's presentation, but I could see from her slides that she did talk about the impacts of climate change around the world. And another concept that's related to the impacts of climate change is vulnerability. And we are probably all now aware of the fact that vulnerability is not really only related to geographical location, but also is related to other factors such as social, political, and economical dimension in a given time and context. And in this regard, I think most of us that are here are aware of the fact that those potentially the marginal communities and those that are in the least developed countries of the global south have been recognized as more vulnerable to climate change. In this regard, therefore, to address vulnerability to climate change and adapting to the impacts that has been shared early in the earlier presentation, we can identify two distinct challenges. First being the fact that the perception of climate risk and experience of managing these risks differs amongst marginal and poor communities and are also complex. These experiences as well as perceptions are shaped by their adaptive capacity, exposure to these threats, and also their agency. The other factor being the fact that there are existing structures of vulnerability that are perpetuated by a range of barriers that limit opportunities for representing these perceptions as of risk in existing policies and their assessments of risk. Now, individuals as well as communities and groups have been adapting to climate risk in multiple ways for many years, basically around the world. Community-based adaptation, probably over the last 20 years or so, has evolved as an approach to adapt to climate risk. Essentially, this entails consulting communities or these communities that are at risk, incorporating their perception, their views into existing policies. So this particular lecture that we developed, Saleem and myself, focuses on what community-based adaptation is. We also share what are some of the drivers of CBAs as well as some of the enablers and also some of the existing debates that surrounds the community-based adaptation. Towards the end of the lecture, I will share another concept that has evolved from community-based adaptation, I would argue, which is called locally led adaptation, but that we'll talk about it towards the end of the lecture. So what is really community-based adaptation? Essentially, CBA has been described as a community-led and driven process that incorporates community perceptions and views of risk and how they want to address these risks. So essentially, this is more rather than doing something for them as opposed to and imposing those solutions on them. So this is more like a community-driven process where things are done in consultation, but also in their participation to address the risk they face. Now, this is typically delivered in the form of project interventions, mostly interventions that are undertaken by non-government organizations, but can also be done by government parties. The first CBA project was essentially undertaken in Bangladesh back in 2004. I will mention it's a project that was undertaken by CARE. It's called the Reducing Vulnerability to Climate Change Project, or RVCC. CBA projects typically uses principles to bottom up and participatory adaptation processes to amplify essentially local voices into the decision-making process for adaptation, and therefore incorporating their local knowledges to identify problems. Essentially, when I say identified problems, the problems would have to be identified, not just scientific processes or expert, but also with communities. Now, CBA is arguably CBA arguably empowers community in three ways. First is it draws upon, through a participatory assessment process, it draws on the community experience to risk and what sort of risks are posed by climate change to communities, and emphasizing the development needs to address those risks, and therefore incorporating those knowledges into the decision-making process empowers those communities that are at risk. The second is by engaging community members in that process of decision-making, as well as prioritizing the local needs, also empowers communities. The third is the fact that by bringing into attention of the community members that these risks they face potentially in the long term, as well as in the existing processes. So therefore, in building their knowledge base and also enhancing their current knowledge potentially enhances their adaptive capacity. And arguably, community-based adaptation to a great extent is about enhancing adaptive capacity of communities that are at risk. So why CBA really evolved? First of all, community-based climate change is really global, but how we experience is more sort of local or regional. And if we look at the history of adaptation, mostly this has been reduced to climate science or models-based impacts, which often ignores the experience or how communities at the local level experience them. So, and as I mentioned, that impacts differ from communities to communities, both spatially as well as temporally. And so therefore, depending on specific circumstances like social, cultural, and political, these impacts may vary, and especially the perception of risk and as well as how communities experience these. So therefore, experts have also argued that the solutions to address climate change should also be locally specific and therefore needs to be driven by communities that are experienced or that are exposed to local level. Now, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, have tried to map different approaches to address different approaches to climate change impacts or to adaptation. In the x-axis, we see the temporal axis, which is short-term to long-term, versus the y-axis is more like the different tiers from household to multi-stakeholder level or national level. So just to give you an example, there are several risk-based approaches which involves science-driven or technology-driven models, and that can range from short-term to long-term, but can also engage national to household levels. CBA, on the other hand, is very much based within a community, and as I mentioned earlier, that it takes into the approach of consulting communities, trying to understand that what are their local knowledge, how they want to how they see these challenges in their day-to-day life, how they experience these, and then therefore what would be their intervention depending on the resources that are available to a particular community. In this regard, as I mentioned earlier, that CBA is mostly delivered in the form of an intervention such as a project or a program, mostly a project-based intervention. So typically CBA interventions are not, when in practice, they're not really so different from a development intervention. It's not really so much about what a community or a particular group is doing, but rather with what sort of knowledge and why they're doing. And that's the difference between a CBA project versus a regular development project. Just to give you an example, so for example, in an urban setup, our municipalities or communities might be taking many interventions for urban development. Whereas if you are to label that kind of project as a community-based adaptation project, first you have to know that why a particular intervention is designed, what sort of risk we are considering behind that particular design, and in the future, projecting what sort of change that might incur upon that particular community, and that sort of consideration has to be taken into that sort of risk has to be taken into consideration when we are designing a CBA project. But as I said, in practice or on the ground, it may not look too much different from a regular development project. So as many of us know, the AR6, IPCC AR6 has been out now, and the CBA has also been incorporated in Chapter 5 and many other areas. So it does have a place in the AR6 report. I picked up really a summary sentence from there, which says that community-based adaptation basically are strategies which involve locally driven and place-based adaptation approaches. And what is important to note here is that they recognize with high confidence that CBA can help build adaptive capacity to climate change. However, require explicit attention to power dynamics, respect for local and indigenous knowledge system. And then also communities need to have access to adequate resources, future climatic trends, and also there should be coordination at multiple levels of governance and for CBA to be effective. And this is the AR6 Working Group 2 report suggests that this is with high confidence that, well, CBA can build adaptive capacity, but for them to be effective, these factors need to be taken into consideration. In the lecture that we have included in the book, we have provided a framework for CBA, which has been provided by Chris Eby and colleagues back in 2008 in the context of health-based, community-based adaptation, but this is more or less applicable to any CBA project. I've not gone into the details of these different steps that we have recognized here, but which you can find in the book. But very briefly, the first step for community-based adaptation starts with community outreach, reaching out to the community, building a rapport with them. This could be initiated by an external actor, but also community-based organizations or community leaders. But typically, that's the first step where you need to recognize that there's a problem, reach out to the communities, explaining to them that, okay, there might be a challenge which have to be addressed. And then the second sort of stage under that particular step is establishing what sort of outcomes or outputs you want to achieve through an intervention. So therefore, a management structure also need to be incorporated or installed within the particular intervention. The second step is really analyzing a situation, what sort of risk exists, what type of climate risk we're talking about. And this is where we go beyond scientific knowledge and go out to the communities trying to understand that, okay, whether what the model says is correct or not. So basically validating what we are experiencing, but also taking into local level experiences of risk. Then this third step is essentially mapping assets, where we try to look at what sort of assets exist within a community. So therefore, this could be not only just financial resources, but other sorts of resources. Financial resources, typically what we have seen in the past is sourced from outside, but there are other sort of beyond community knowledges, there could be other resources. So for example, if there has to be a cyclone shelter that needs to be built as a part of a CBA project, there could be masonry experiences within community members who could then be employed. And there's additional benefit of engaging community members is that then you have the community buy-in in the process. So then the follow-up is stakeholder involvement. And once you have mapped the assets, then you engage, reach out to different stakeholder groups, reach out to them and trying to understand that, okay, what are the different interventions that could be undertaken. And so that takes us to the intervention prioritization, which involves really identifying what sort of intervention can be taken and what communities are comfortable with. Then the next step is resource mobilization. So essentially what you have identified in the asset mapping and other subsequent stages, you mobilize these resources to implement the interventions that you have prioritized. Now, in this whole process, something that we need to be really very careful about is elite capture. So elite capture, there's two ways this elite capture can happen. So often external actors who are coming in with the funding, they might have their own agenda. So we have to be very careful that, okay, the community priorities are reflected as opposed to external actors' own agenda. So that's one form of elite capture. We have to be very careful. The second form is that there could be power relations gap within communities. So therefore, powerful parties within a particular community may want to implement interventions of their own choice, which might not serve the priorities of the most vulnerable within a community. So that type of elite capture, we also have to be very careful. And CBA have often been criticized to be vulnerable to these sort of elite capture. And to address some of these, the next step, which is evaluation or monitoring evaluation and learning, is very important, which essentially highlights that whether these processes have incorporated community perspectives in or not. And so therefore, and whether the implementation process is going on smoothly or not. So another approach towards monitoring, evaluation, and learning from a traditional MEL where external actors come in and analyze the project. It has also been suggested that a participatory evaluation process is incorporated in the framework for CBA, which also allows community members to have a voice in whether the projects that are being implemented in their community is working for them or not. But as I said, the whole framework is centered around the fact that the CBA project ultimately should build community adaptive capacity. So going forward, as I mentioned, that CBA project is, the concept of CBA is not too old. It's been there for only about 15, 20 years or so, and numerous projects have been implemented, and it's more of an experiential knowledge. So we are gathering lessons from the field to develop the theory. And that's in general, the theory of adaptation is that it's an experiential knowledge as opposed to a theoretical knowledge. So we learn from experience or from the field, and then we go back to the lab to come up with a theory. So Saleemul Huq and Hannah Reid back in 2007, they summarized some of the lessons that they were gaining from the earlier projects. So the first of these experiences was that outsiders must first gain trust of community members. So this entails the first step that we've just shared, that with rapport building with those communities, the targeted communities, is the first step. And this is absolutely critical and crucial to a successful implementation of a CBA project. The second step engages with communication about climate change. So typically, experts or external actors, when they come in, they often communicate in a very esoteric or complex scientific language, which is not very clear to communities, and then they often sort of are scared to talk, and that's another way for you to sort of widen that sort of power relations gap between the communities as well as these external actors. So communication has to be done in communities' own language, and possibly through traditional means of communication such as art and theater, or modern methods such as video. And community members always feel more comfortable to engage in those particular forms of communication or modes of communication. Continuing that, the initial learnings of when you're trying to come up with an CBA intervention, what you first must do is build on or understand community indigenous capacities and knowledge, and the current practices to cope with climatic hazard. And this, when I mentioned about the AR6 assessment, they also highlight the fact that, I mean, these CBA projects must capture indigenous knowledge or local knowledge and capacities that exist within a community. And as I mentioned, that once a CBA project is set up, a CBA project very much looks like a standard development project as opposed to a standalone response to climate change. And the difference really is not so much on what intervention is being implemented, but or what sort of input is given to that intervention, but it's sort of what the community is doing and why they're doing it and with what sort of knowledge. And it's understandably, the adaptation element essentially introduces the community to the notion of climate risk. So therefore, increases or enhances their knowledge of climate risk. And that also empowers them. And these then are taken into consideration when they are prioritizing different activities. Going forward, as I said, that the adaptation is essentially a classic case of learning by doing or an action research. And CBA is very much an example of that. So therefore, the theory and practice of CBA as it expands, we need to learn further. And with many more pilot activities, we can gather more knowledge and probably strengthen the concept as it becomes, or as it is being adopted by different entities across the world. Very important for us to remember that any CBA, any adaptation or community-based adaptation projects must be designed for the most vulnerable. And as I mentioned earlier, that elite capture or being aware of the power relations gap, therefore, is very important for adaptation practitioners, because if these are not designed for the most vulnerable, then essentially these won't be successful. And there are numerous examples. So for example, one of the early interventions suggested from the experience of Bangladesh and many other countries is that to adapt to rising salinity levels, shrimp farming was proposed. But as time progressed, we recognized that shrimp farming, the benefits of shrimp farming mostly went to external actors, absentee farmers, but not, whereas they made marginal farmers or landless farmers more vulnerable. So that's a classic example of how, without consideration of the community perspectives, CBA projects may also render communities more vulnerable and can become maladaptive. There are other examples that are suggested from Karen McNamara and Ross Westerby's work in the Pacific, which also highlights how CBA projects, without proper consideration of community perspectives, may become even maladaptive. And maladaptation is also a concept that has gained a really high level of prominence in the recent IPCC report. The second thing that we've highlighted is that once community vulnerability has been established using the best available science, also through the engagement and communities, that's when CBA projects should proceed. But it should not proceed alone only on the basis of scientific knowledge. But it should be through a participatory process where community perspectives have been incorporated thoroughly. And as I said earlier, that ultimately CBA interventions will only succeed how it can enhance adaptive capacity of communities, but also how it can transform the power relations within that exist within a particular community. Now, Going forward, I want to highlight a couple of CBA examples. I won't go through both of them, but in this lecture series, we mention two CBA examples. First is United Nations Development Programme's FFF project, and I've given the links here, so those who are interested could go to these links. The second is the RVCC project from CARE, and RVCC is the first sort of CBA project that was ever developed. So this is also an interesting case study that you can look up. But I will quickly describe in the subsequent slides how does the FFF project look like. So essentially, coastal Bangladesh is highly vulnerable to climatic hazards such as cyclonic storm surges, tidal flooding, and coastal erosion. And the community-based adaptation project to climate change through coastal afforestation project, which is the FFF, the full name for the FFF project, essentially was developed to enhance the adaptive capacity of coastal communities through diversifying their livelihoods, providing opportunities for income generation, and building community resilience against those impacts that we mentioned in the first bullet. This particular project was implemented by UNDP between 2003 and 2013. And the central guiding principle behind the project was that adaptation efforts should generate should not only be designed to address community risk or to climate change, but also should provide opportunities to generate income for local communities. The adaptation action for this particular project was that the project introduced an elevated ditch dike model called the forest, fish, and fruit model. And that's why it's called the FFF model. The model provided a way to utilize sort of barren coastal lands to support these lands through sort of mangrove forest or establishment of mangrove forest, and plant fruit on the dikes, on the side of the dikes, and sort of farm fish in the ditches that were constructed, and these would then provide communities to sell the products from the fruits from the fruit trees and the fish farms, and generate livelihoods and income for the communities. Now, the target communities were landless communities in the coastal areas, so they were provided the barren land. So essentially, as I said, that these were targeted to some of the most vulnerable communities, and they themselves participated in the construction of the dikes and planting of the trees. And also because they own the land, they were also enjoying the benefits of some of these adaptation actions. The dikes were the other sort of benefits of this particular project was that because the dikes or the ponds were built right next to their households, so women could also participate in these projects, because typically in a conservative society, women didn't like to go out too far from their households. So, and these ponds being located very close to their households allowed them to participate in the adaptation action. Now, the planting of the trees on the coastal, barren coastal land not only provided structural barrier against the storms, but also it enhanced or provided the opportunity to preserve the local coastal ecosystem, and therefore provided a guard against coastal erosion and damage against windstorms. So these are the adaptation actions explaining that were going behind this particular CBA project. In picture here in sort of in schedule and sort of you see in panel A, you see the model or the plan for adaptation action. So in the middle, you have the ponds or the ditch. On the sides, you have the dikes built on which there would be fruit trees. And towards the sea, the mangroves would be guarding these farms from, as well as the homestead from windstorms. Community member, panel B basically shows how the dikes look like while they were being constructed. And panel C shows the community members were participating in the construction process. D is sort of how a completed project looked like. And this is beyond like 4 or 5 years after the project was completed. So we did an assessment on the effectiveness of the project, and we could see that there were areas where actual marginal communities were given priority. These particular interventions were still in operation 4 or 5 years, even 4 or 5 years after the project was completed. But there were other areas where not landless communities, but others, other local political elites were given priorities. Though in those areas, some of these projects were not operational beyond the project period. So what were the project outputs and outcomes? So by 2011, the project ran from 2003 to 2013, as I mentioned earlier, but by 2011, a total of 14,400 households were able to employ the triple F model. And as we can see, that the project itself employed an area of adaptation interventions to basically ranging from mangrove forests to building to generating incomes from fish farms and fruit trees. But in this case, what the project argued that resilience was enhanced using the structural interventions, which were the creation of the mangrove greenbelt, but also through the income generation measures. The project also raised local people's sort of knowledge of climate risk, but also enhanced the capacities of practitioners, government employees, and therefore enhances their institutional capacity through sort of training programs. And this is what the Triple F project in general looked like. Now, coming back to CBA in itself, CBA although has been very promising, but through literature and experience from the ground, we have been able to identify several challenges exist within the particular concept. So the first of these being the perception of a community. Now, when CBA was being developed, the notion of community was more like a community was a homogeneous entity, but in reality is far from so. And communities, within a particular community, there are many differences around culture, power relations, and traditions. And so therefore, community is not a homogeneous entity, which originally it was thought so. And in particular, the power relations gap within communities can impede the success of a CBA project. The second was achieving meaningful participation, often inclusive and fair and meaningful participation at the local level. Particularly engaging those that are poor and marginal is very difficult, and elite capture remains a constant challenge with CBA. The other being subordinate local perspective, and this is where we see that the experts or those that come in with scientific knowledge often dominate the discourse of CBA or the interventions design. So this has also been a challenge with CBA, and as I mentioned, that Karen McNamara and Ross Westerby they have narrated several examples of sort of elite capture in the Pacific. The second is sensitive to local culture. So often CBA interventions are not sensitive local cultures. So for example, there are several interventions that are designed in Bangladesh. So for example, I'm not sure can't quite remember whether this is in Bangladesh or in the Pacific. So one of the interventions that were proposed was a community latrine, and the local people were not really sensitized enough, or as well as this was not a culturally appropriate or sensitive approach. So ultimately the sort of community latrine intervention failed, so wasn't really a successful intervention. So therefore not being sensitive to local culture may not only may not be able to reduce vulnerabilities, but also may inhibit both planned and autonomous, planned as well as autonomous adaptation initiatives. The other, as I said, that in practice, there's very little difference between CBA and development, and this can become a challenge for funding entities who are often trying to artificially, we argue that they're trying to create an artificial barrier between adaptation and development, because often adaptation is argued to show the additionality. But if you look at often adaptation is a factor of the development deficit. So therefore, adaptation for funding entities, often the difference between or the distinction between a community-based adaptation intervention and a regular development adaptation intervention may be very difficult. Therefore, often these are not funded. This is also a challenge. The last being mainstreaming adaptation in national policies is also challenging, because in countries with poor governance or political system, mainstreaming local perspectives can be difficult, and often local government, national governments, not just those that are in poor governments, but in many areas, national governments remain hindrance to incorporating local perspectives. Of time and often they look down upon local perspectives. So this remains a big challenge, which is mainstreaming community-based adaptation in national policies. But this is increasingly being, experts, as practitioners, as well as academics, are trying to reduce this particular challenge, and recognizing CBA within AR6 goes a long way towards addressing this particular challenge. Now, as we say that these challenges exist, a new from community-based adaptation, a new concept is slowly emerging, which is called local-led adaptation, which tries to address some of the challenges that we see within CBA, but also in general that exists with adaptation. And first of this is really access to finance. So a recent IIED, the International Institute for Environment and Development, has highlighted the fact that very little, less than 2% of global climate finance reaches to those people that are really at the front line of climate change impacts. So therefore, these people that are at the front line of climate change impacts do not have access to adequate resources and adapt. So to address this particular gap, and also the fact that their perceptions are not adequately incorporated in adaptation policies and practice, the growing of the budding adaptation narrative in policy and academic circle is calling for an approach that moves beyond tokenistic participation of communities, or community-based sort of participation. Rather, it's arguing that the whole adaptation approach should be led basically by community-based institution or community members, and therefore locally led adaptation, or LLA, has been defined as something that is controlled by local people, and it's grounded in local realities. It should ensure equity, inclusivity, and also should be facilitated by local network and institution. So LLA is still a concept which is very much being developed, and it's been there only for around 2 or 3 years. So the 2019 report, report from the Global Commission on Adaptation, the Adapt Now, really set the political stage for adaptation and has played a major role in providing the political momentum behind LLA. And since then, LLA has gained quite a bit of traction. In fact, during the last COP in Glasgow, the presidency UK has committed nearly £45 million towards LLA, recognizing the fact that it remains a major approach towards achieving successful adaptation on the ground. And between 2019 and the last COP, IIED, World Resources Institute, WRI, and GCA has collectively developed 8 principles around LLA. And nearly 70 organizations globally has signed up for this. However, we also like to highlight the fact that these principles any organization that has signed up to this principle must recognize that it's not only about providing access to finance, but it's also about addressing the power relations gap that exists within experts or policymakers, or those that are the other sort of high-level stakeholders within adaptation, to those that are really at the forefront of climate change. So really, it needs to be seen how local-led adaptation as well as community-based adaptation as an approach towards adapting to climate change addresses some of these challenges, such as power relations gap, and as well as enhancing adaptive capacity of communities that are at risk. So with that, I'd like to thank you all again for giving me the opportunity to present our slides. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Feisal, for really sharing and bringing forward the important role of CBA, the challenges of it, but the absolute essential need to to address those challenges. And thanks for also bringing forward the locally led adaptation, really up to the moment of where we are in this extremely important area related to adaptation for the most vulnerable communities. Over to you. We do have some questions. Oh, Manishka, over to you for posing the questions to Faisal. And then we'll have our, after the individual questions for Faisal, then we'll have our panel discussion.
Great. Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you, Faisal. We already have a few questions, so which is a good thing. I have a couple of prepared questions, but I think we'll have to leave that for another day. So the first question is from Ro. Thank you for your talk. How much variability are you finding in adaptation needs within local geographic regions? Example, adjacent villages in a region. How much pushback have you experienced from adaptation measures? For example, not in my backyard.
So thank you. My experience is mostly based in Bangladesh, so a lot of these examples probably would come from that context. We do see that there is variability. It's also which people you ask, not just community or village to village. It also within a community, whom do you ask? For example, if you only go to the male members of your community, you don't recognize or you don't really take into consideration a female or gender-based perspective. So there's quite a bit of variability. So as CBA practitioners, what we argue is that what you need to do is that if you're trying to design, I mean, typically what we do is that we target a community and we go to them. But if you want to, I mean, adaptation, what I want to mention here is that adaptation is not a neutral process. There's always a winners and losers. In the process, what you need to recognize is that, okay, you have to prioritize the choices of the most vulnerable. And that could mean that, okay, the variability from community to community, it could be if you're trying to build a embankment across two communities and if your most vulnerables are those that are lying in the upstream, you can prioritize them, but you also have to take into consideration what impact it will have on those that are at the downstream level. Now, if those that are more powerful, if they're the downstream of an embankment, and then you'll certainly have pushback. On the other hand, if they're on the upstream and the marginals are on the downstream, then they might not have as much power for that kind of pushback. So what I'm trying to say that it's very depends on what your target community and their particular experience. And as adaptation practitioners, what we tend to do is that we try to reach out to as many people within a particular community before really designing an intervention. And if we follow that particular framework that we see, first thing that you need to ensure is that the participation of community members or local knowledge cannot only be tokenistic purposes. It must reflect the community perspectives and community needs. I hope I adequately addressed this.
Thank you, Faisal. Yes. So the next question we have is from Wilfine, but I feel that question might work really well for the next discussion. So maybe we'll leave that for the session that David is moderating, because it's the question is, as climate change is global and the impacts local, how is it possible to decrease it in a short time? Then are solutions global or local? I think that's a good one for the next discussion. So I'll move on to Minnie's question. What is the typical medium and long-term sustainability of CBA projects after the end of the project period? In other words, are communities able to continue the adaptation absent NGO or government support, with understanding that this is also a challenge with development projects?
So yeah, this is a very good question. And as I said, CBA project has been suffering from this particular challenge that, well, once the project is done, the NGO is gone, then these projects often do not survive. But there are also examples when if you have adequate community buy-in, And if they could, essentially, if they could generate income out of the particular intervention beyond the project period, then these tend to stay, or then they tend to survive. But that's sort of like a generalization through a broad brush, like a generation of income. But there are examples where CBA projects have been successful, but typically it has to be through community buy-in. Community buy-in, where community members are thoroughly engaged, and then only these projects can survive beyond its period. As the example that I showed in the FFF project, we went there back in 2018, and the project ended in 2005. In some communities, the projects were still going on. Community members were maintaining it, and these were sites where targeted communities were vulnerable, and they were given the land. So they felt that these particular land belonged to them. This was their own asset, and therefore they were maintaining it. Whereas in other areas where the land was not provided to somebody who was influential and didn't see the benefit after the project ended, that's when they abandoned. So really depends. But typically what we see is that somehow community need to see that, okay, they can accrue benefit from an intervention once the project ended. The other thing that I'd like to quickly add to this is that something that we are arguing, and this is also going towards local-led adaptation, is that project-based intervention often faces challenge. Rather, we need to be going more towards programmatic approaches, not just 1 or 2 year projects, more like 5-year or 10-year programs that tend to be more successful. Okay.
Great,
Manish,
thank you. Thank you. We have 3 more questions. I'll try to get to at least 1 or 2 of them. I'm just taking it in the order we received. Imani says, we know that the people most affected by climate change are the least funded to address it. What are the best practices to deal with political actors committed to the status quo that resist efforts to mitigate the effects of climate change?
So essentially, this has been a persistent challenge, and often those, this is also related to the power, because those who have money, or those the donors, they have more. They ultimately, at the end of the day, they have more shots. But we are trying to see a pushback from communities. So especially the grassroots organizations, they're trying to say that, well, this has to change, and rather the funding. So what we see is that the Global Climate Fund, such as Adaptation Funds, Adaptation Fund and other funds, they're trying to come up with, those who have signed up with the local-led adaptation pledge, they're trying to give a more autonomy to local or national entities. But again, that's not always the case. Still, donors have some sort of, more or less more power over others. But what we are arguing is that those who are signing up to these the pledges, that they must recognize that, well, the funding cannot be siphoned out by middlemen. Rather, it should be committed, and there should be an appropriate monitoring and evaluation where the money is going. So those who are interested could follow the IIED reports around local-led adaptation, that, okay, how we could potentially ensure that the money or the finance reaches to the local level. Again, these, there aren't that many examples out there, but this could be done. However, I think it's more of a political decision, or more political buy-in of those that are currently holding the money or holding the power. They need to first say that, well, at the same time, those such as the community-based organization or grassroots organization should build more power, should build more momentum, put more pressure on these stakeholders, that, okay, they need to delegate more power to local communities or local community-based organizations, so that they have more access to finance.
Thank you, Feisal. We have Anna, who says, could you comment on transform power relations and give an example of the possible outcomes?
So transforming power relations, this is, if you look at local development and in many development projects, Transforming power relations basically means that, okay, when an external actor comes in, they only come as facilitator, not so much as ruling. So, and this power relations essentially means that, okay, the voices of those that are actually impacted are those that are most marginal, that is reflected. And there are several examples of this. So for example, the grassroots organizations such as Spark or slum dwellers organizations, they have certain structures where they allow actually people that live within a slum, and then they have certain voices. They represent their community members, and then they have voices in the decision-making process. So if we follow how they work, that can give us good lessons. I mean, these entities often have not been engaged so much in the climate change discussion, but are now being made part into the or now being drawn to this climate change discussion, because they can easily see that their everyday, day-to-day activities are being impacted by climate change. So the Global Center for Adaptation, through their local-led adaptation action track, has been engaging with entities such as Huayru Commission or the Slum Dwellers International. There are other entities, Tepteba and other entities, and bringing these stakeholders or these parties to the discussion allows us to understand that how they work with ground, how they sort of transform power relations within communities. And traditional stakeholder groups must learn from these entities, and maybe that's how we transform the power relations and ensure that voices of those that are most marginal are incorporated in the adaptation decision-making process.
Thank you, Faisal. I think Johanna's question and also Wilfine's would actually be great for the next discussion. So David, over to you. Maybe we can have Faisal briefly addressing Johanna's question, and the panelists can intervene as well. Over to you, David.
Yes, so as indicated by the slide, question relates to where are we going? What is the approach that you, the panelists, envision for allowing impacts and adaptation work to become more effective, or to use some of the phrases that have been described before, to develop more momentum? Is it advertising? Is it just continuing what's being done? And I would like to add a little twist in addition to Wilfine's question about climate change being global and impacts being local, both in terms of biodiversity and in terms of community-based adaptation. We don't actually know what the future is going to look like. We don't really know what mankind's pathway is going to be for the release of trace gases in the future. And we actually don't really know what the climate sensitivity is. We don't know what a lot of the local impacts will ultimately be. And in this sort of environment of uncertainty, how do we go forward with impact and with precision that's sometimes necessary, either for general biodiversity questions or for community-based adaptation? And I'll just give one example. There are examples of people who are preparing for increased flood levels associated with rivers in certain regions. But the past has shown that our estimate of what will actually happen as climate warms has underestimated in many respects what actually does happen. So where do we go in terms of that uncertainty? How do we both increase the effectiveness and deal with uncertainty, both for things like biodiversity and things like community-based adaptation? So please, one panelist after another. Feisal, would you like to start?
So yeah, I mean, thank you for David. I think what you highlighted, that it's very difficult for us to know that, okay, what projection, where we are going. In terms of community-based adaptation or the perspective of the Global South, what I'd like to highlight is that first of all, we need to recognize that there existing development deficit, which exists within these communities, which restricts them to respond to these long-term challenges. I think one of the questions were that, okay, how do we address the short-term challenges, but then can also address global or long-term challenges? And unless and until existing adaptation funding recognizes these existing development deficits, then it'll be difficult for us to ensure the long-term sustainability of any initiative that are being taken. So I'd give you an example. So in the context of climate change adaptation, often migration is discussed as sort of an adaptation strategy. But migration, if we don't take into consideration the factors that are contributing to migration, existing development gaps or development deficits, then migration in the long term may not help these communities that will try to move away from this risk. In this regard, what I want to highlight is that there's this concept called trapped population. The trapped population concept talks about the fact that, well, when migration needs resources and when you cannot move away from a particular risk, then you get trapped in that particular place. The other way you can get trapped is that maybe you thought that, okay, you are at risk in this particular place in a rural area, then you move to a city and end up in a slum where you're in a worse condition, and then you can't go back. And in each of these cases, if we only think about that, okay, there's climate risk that's causing people to move away from the risk, then that's a problem, because there are other additional drivers that's forcing people to migrate or making them more vulnerable. And there are several case studies that shows that existing adaptation approaches, because they haven't incorporated properly community voices or community perception of risk, those existing or planned adaptation initiatives have actually made people more vulnerable. So they have reinforced vulnerability, recreate vulnerability, or redistributed vulnerability. This has been suggested by Siri Erickson and colleagues in a recent paper in World Development. So what I'm trying to say is that if we want to address the risks in the future, we must recognize that, well, people have, or communities have, development deficits and gaps, and we need to consider what their priorities are, and must not prioritize those risks that are only identified by scientific methods, but also reach out to communities and try to incorporate what they perceive their day-to-day risks are, and combine both day-to-day risk as opposed to long-term risks, which they often cannot predict. I'll stop there.
Yeah. So regardless of what the risks in the future are, none of them will be handleable unless you deal with current inadequacies.
Yes, that's what in summary.
Yeah. Pam?
Yes, I mean, I think that's true for biodiversity as well. As I was showing, biodiversity is being lost. Much of it's not in good condition, and therefore restoring it to good condition will at least go some other way to enable it to cope with climate change. But going to the sort of question that was posed, as climate change is global, the impact's local. I think increasingly, as far as biodiversity is concerned, in the past, perhaps of necessity, we've been looking at sort of mean climate change on an annual timescale, and that's pretty meaningless to most of biodiversity. And I think what we need to do, and increasingly doing, is to look at how biodiversity responds to shorter term climatic events, possibly sort of extreme events. And we need to be orientating our responses in that direction. But also in terms of solutions, I was interested in the sort of parallel between what I was saying about nature-based solutions and what Feisal was saying about CBA or LLA, that they are locally sort of specific and they need to be implemented locally. And I think to be effective, they do need to be implemented locally. But the question that's being asked, certainly for MBS, and I'm sure the same must be true for CBA, is how can we scale them up from these locally community relevant, effective interventions, such that they can start to have at least a regional, if not a global impact. And I think that's something that hasn't really been cracked yet, certainly from the biodiversity perspective.
Can I ask you a question, Pam? Given the ubiquity, at least in certain regions, of managed forests, how can we get forestry, the forestry industry more interested in biodiversity? I've been reading the book Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard, and in it she does discuss the difficulty in getting industry groups to recognize the importance of biodiversity, as opposed to planting sort of monogamous forests of just what they think the consumer will want.
Well, perhaps that's where the answer lies, sort of in the consumer. That's one way of trying to change, what we require forestry companies to produce. It's not just timber, but also I think this is where things like ecosystem services, ecosystem adaptation may come in, and they illustrate how forests deliver more than just timber. And if it can be shown that the companies actually sort of benefit more widely from the functions the forests perform, and that there would be greater benefits if they diversified, then I think that might help to shift them away from that. And whether that will require sort of direct economic incentives, or just better information about the value of forests out with their economic production, I don't know. It's one of the reasons why I'm a bit of a pragmatist and would support, to a reasonable extent, the monetization of ecosystem services, because I think it does help to get people to recognize how important biodiversity is to their life.
Joel, did you have any comment?
Yeah, I did, and I realized time is short. Both, first I want to congratulate both presenters. These are both important and excellent talks, and I think they raise different and yet overlapping issues. So just a couple of observations. First, on the biodiversity, I mean, I really appreciate the talk, Pam, and I provide a lot of good insight. And one of the things, I've been working on this for about over 30 years, actually 35 years now, and I've always thought that the impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity, to me, were one of the most compelling arguments for mitigation, and that, I mean, and it is so potentially so sweeping, and some of your figures really brought that out. And it's interesting too, because, and there may not be time to respond, but I do wonder again today of how much adaptation we can talk about, migration corridors, transplantation, various ideas people were brought up, but how effective will they really be in reducing biodiversity losses? Are these really just Band-Aids, or could they substantially reduce them? And if they can't, what are our options in terms of reducing significant climate change? And I noticed Alan Robock's left the call, but he sort of was getting at this with a question he raised, and it's one of his topics he's worked on for many decades in terms of the degree of intervention. And so I just sort of make that observation. I'd also like to sort of maybe push back a little on Feisal with respect, but I think clearly there is a strong need for locally led adaptation. And I think a lot of it is democratic principles. When we see what's going on in Ukraine is fundamentally about that, self-governance and that kind of thing. But it's also legitimacy and effectiveness, right? If you impose solutions from the top, and people in the community don't buy into them, those solutions may well fail. So you really, you can't be effective in adaptations if they're not bought into at a local level. That said, and I think some of you, Pam and David, some of your discussions were getting into this, it's not clear that all there's that phrase, and it drives me a little nuts, all adaptation is local. Well, no, it can't be. It's not, and it isn't, because while a lot of maybe the vast majority of adaptations are done at the local scale, there is a need for coherence of adaptation at a regional, national, and even international level. The biodiversity is a good example. Think about things like migration corridors or translocation of species. Can you just, would localities do those on their own? Would those be done in a consistent and coherent way? I know, just looking in Colorado, where many decisions on land use are based at county level, we have counties with very different political perspectives right next to each other. I live in one, have another one bordering on us. It's quite different. I can't imagine a coherent approach to biodiversity in these two adjacent counties, and I'm sure that's true all over the world. And so this is a difficult, there's not an easy answer to this, but I think it needs to be recognized that, in many cases, how certainly mitigation has to be addressed globally, and then filter down to all the way down to local level. But adaptation too, in many respects, is going to need a lot of coordination and integration, but you can't push that too far. So I just want to make those observations. And I think these are very challenging issues. And I think in terms of where we go, a lot of the research, I think, can at least inform these kind of decisions, at least point out and analyze the trade-offs in how decisions on these very critical aspects of climate change are going to be addressed. So thanks.
Thanks, Joe. Cynthia, did you have a comment?
Well, we are just coming to the top of our 2 hours. It's been really a really thoughtful discussion, and thank you again to our presenters, Pam Berry and Feisal Rahman, for their really very important presentations on these two. They fit together so well, the biodiversity and climate change, and the community-based, and this discussion on the facets of where are they overlapping, how do they relate to each other, and the scales, the discussion. And Joel, thanks for your very thoughtful comments at the end about scales. So I think we just are going to now turn to Manishka we have Jen. Let's see, what do we have? We have Jen, and then we have Manishka, and I think that's how we'll wrap up today. If Jen could share the related educational materials from NASA, and then Manishka, if you could share what is the next webinar in 2 weeks, and then we'll sign off. Thanks, Jen. Over to you.
Okay, so I'll be quick, but the first resource is a unit plan targeted at high school students that focuses on climate change in the urban setting. And then the second one we have here is the NASA Climate Change Research Initiative, which is a year-long STEM research opportunity for educators and graduate students to work with NASA scientists. And in the summer, the team will also add undergraduate and high school interns. And then the third here is a toolkit for biodiversity research with resources on topics such as species distribution and habitat suitability. So I can add these links in the chat, and that's it from me.
Thank you. And just to comment on the urban, Faisal's talk focused on rural communities primarily, but the urban community-based adaptation is also crucially important, as Manishka and David and I are here in the New York metropolitan region. But some of the same issues of engaging and giving the power to the communities in the neighborhoods themselves. This is something that the New York City Panel on Climate Change has grappled with and is grappling with right now. Those power dynamics, right here in New York City. But Manishka, over to you for the wrap up to say where, just I guess one more information about the book, and what do we have to look forward to in 2 weeks for the next webinars?
Thank you, Cynthia. I've already shared the recording details in the chat, so you can get it from the CC Run website. We'll paste it again. And in 2 weeks, we have 2 lectures coming up, but I'm actually going to paste the names of the 2 lectures in the chat because there's a small typo. So it's actually going, so it's going to be Robert Nichols talking. He's going to be talking about the consequences of sea level rise in coastal regions. And then Joseph Alcamo is going to be talking about climate impacts on water resources. And there was a slight mix up when we typed up those lecture names, but we have those coming up, and I've put the full names in the chat, and we will send you the registration link. Some of you have registered already, and looking forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks. Over to you, Cynthia.
Cool. Thanks so much, everybody. Again, thanks to the speakers, thanks to the participants, thanks for the great questions and the really thoughtful discussion. And here's we're really trying to have the book be reaching as wide an audience as possible. And with this new, and that the slides that are there are really this asset and resource for when we think back to the poll of what the work and how the participants work in climate change, or educators, or researchers, or communicators. We very much hope that that this will continue to be an asset and a resource for everybody who participates. So thanks so much. Looking forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.